You know, I was astonished when I got out my date book and realized that Eric Fawcett has been gone 15 years now. This surprised me. Everyone wants to keep alive the memories of special persons that we have known. And Eric was important to so many of us that we meet every year or so to freshen up our stories about him. And this is one of those evenings where we're meeting in honor of Eric Fawcett, and it's my turn to share. Eric was born in 1927 in a textile town in England. His mother, Florrie, had worked in the mill as a child. It was a harsh memory that prompted her to push her sons to study hard. And indeed, Eric's diligence paid off very well with a scholarship to study physics at Cambridge. And there he met Pat, and they married in 1954, moving to Ottawa for 2 years before returning to England, where Eric worked on radar research. Their 3 children were born there as Brits. In 1961, the Fawcetts moved to New Jersey, and Eric worked there at the Bell Labs until 1970, when he came to U of T and spent the next 23 years as a professor of physics. Don't ask me to explain his scientific research, but I can say this much, that one of his major contributions was the invention of a technique to probe magnetism in metals. Most of us here, of course, remember Eric not for his brilliant research, but for his activism. He often expressed frustration because most other scientists refused to address global problems, even in their spare time. He thought scientists had created so many problems that they had a special duty to help solve them. But evidently, most of them disagreed and still do. Still, despite his irritation, Eric managed to recruit a few of his colleagues in the physical sciences, both locally and through his many international contacts. He was active in Pugwash, and in 1980, he founded a small committee called Directing Science Toward Peace, which led in the following year to the creation of Science for Peace. Eric was the founding president and served it in 1,000 ways throughout the rest of his life. Not satisfied with mobilizing scientists at U of T, in 1985 he founded another international organization, SPIN, S-P-I-N, the Science for Peace International Network, which soon grew to include some 40 organizations around the world. They mainly exchanged literature among themselves. Eric was a great believer in email and enthusiastically peppered his colleagues every day with more information than most of them wanted. His activism also covered issues of human rights and social justice, especially in the Soviet Union, which he visited frequently. He worked hard to help Jewish refuseniks get a chance to leave. And several times he joined dissident scientists in their informal seminars around Moscow kitchen tables before the heady days of perestroika and glasnost. He fiercely defended the creator of the Soviet H-bomb, Andrei Sakharov, who was kept under house arrest for several years in Gorky. I once interviewed academician Vitaly Goldansky, the leader of the Soviet Pugwash group, and I happened to mention a peace conference that some of my Science for Peace friends had attended in Moscow. And here is my transcript of Goldansky's reply. Yes, I remember, by the way, that I was the chairman of one of the sessions in July 1986. And Eric Fawcett took the floor and suggested, that was one day before the end of the meeting, that we immediately invite Sakharov to come here from Gorky. I told him, this is an interesting idea which deserves attention. Unfortunately, it's too late to do anything. We end tomorrow. But I think it should be taken into account, and we should think about this possibility. And in December, Sakharov was here. Actually, Goldansky had a lot to do with bringing Sakharov. He wasn't slouchy himself on that issue. That suggestion, however, was pure Eric, bless his heart. I don't know how he expected to smuggle Sakharov past the KGB guards who surrounded his Gorky apartment, but he would gladly have tried to do it. Eric retired from U of T in 1993, though he continued his peace work until liver cancer reduced his energies. His retirement allowed him to pursue new interests, notably yoga, piano lessons, and an exploration of Quakerism. He died 7 years later, leaving the world a better place because of his enthusiastic nagging. Good work, Eric. Thanks a million.
Friends, Canada as a voice for peace and development. Question mark. The question mark came because we came up with this title before the election. When Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accepted the election victory on election night, he said to those people who have wondered and worried about the loss of Canada's voice of compassion and constructivism, he said, I have a message for those people. Canada is back. And so we felt that our choice of words of peace and development and of being the voice of that was very appropriate for a talk this evening. As we also find that we invited the right person at the right time. Lloyd Axworthy represented the voice of Canada on the international stage, and what a voice it was, from 1996 to the year 2000. I can't think of a foreign minister since Lester Pearson who's done more good for Canada, Canada's role in the world, and for the world than Lloyd Axworthy. And so we're so privileged to have him here tonight. In fact, it's apocryphal that when he was a student, he was not very much interested in politics. He told me much more interested in football. And yet his football coach told him that he had to come and listen to a talk by a politician. He thought, yuck, a politician. And then he went to the talk, and it was by Lester B. Pearson. And it changed his life. So I think there may be young people out in our audience today. One day might become our foreign minister with the influence of this succession of the spirit of Lester B. Pearson, Pearsonianism, Axworthyism, that will catch fire tonight, or that has already caught fire in the Canadian population. So Lloyd served under 3 different prime ministers in their cabinets. One was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which we might call now Trudeau père, if you want to use the French expression, versus Trudeau fils. Or if you want to use the American expression, it would be Trudeau 15 as opposed to Trudeau 23 that we currently have. And in those cabinets, he served in a number of different roles, but for us here, the highlight was the period as foreign minister. He came into all of his positions with a deep love of people. I can feel this in everything that he touches, including his suggestion or choice of the subtitle for tonight's talk, Conversation, because he really wants to reach out to you, to have your voice heard, and to have a conversation with us. So we'll be having that conversation with Lloyd in that spirit of people-driven and people-motivated service. He brought into the idea not a nationalistic, power-hungry approach, but an approach that was developed centered on the human being individually, globally, as global citizens. And so when he came into government, he fostered the Human Security Network. Instead of putting emphasis on national security, whatever that vague concept might be, he said the basis of national security is the human being in each of those nations. So that the human security agenda was to look after the security of the person. And the security didn't just mean freedom from fear, it also meant freedom from want. So he developed a network, actually became called the Human Security Network, partnering with like-minded nations, beginning with Norway, to bring countries together that would work on developing the human security agenda. One of the tragedies that he saw when he was visiting around as foreign minister was in Central America, where he saw some people who had been maimed by landmines, who were cutting their own wood to be used as prosthetics to replace what had been blown up through these terrible instruments. And he was appalled by this and said, we have to do something about it. So coming in early 1996, he got his foreign ministry to start working on the landmine issue. And then later on in 1996, he made one of the most boldest moves of a Canadian foreign minister ever. He assembled nations of the world who would agree to a common understanding that landmines should be banned. And I went to Ottawa to the old railway station, the conference center, and I felt this was a bit historic, so I even brought my mother. And I stepped out to meet with NGOs, but then she told me afterwards that there had been something quite historic had happened. Lloyd Axworthy went before those countries and said, I will invite you back to Ottawa within 1 year to sign this treaty if we can find the means to develop it and negotiate it within 1 year. And everyone thought that was an impossibility, but he made the bold move, got a standing ovation, the NGOs were thrilled, and then he built the partnerships that were needed to make that happen within 1 year. And one of the partnerships that he developed was with civil society. So he worked with NGOs, just like he's one of us tonight. He worked to build with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which received the Nobel Peace Prize. And frankly, I think if the Nobel Peace Prize were given 3 ways, it would have gone, the third would have been to Lloyd Axworthy with Jody Williams and the ICBL. And certainly he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for that landmine work. And working with those partnerships, raising media awareness, he was able to create the core of countries that could put forward a very progressive text. And figures like Hillary Clinton and others were having an influence on the discussions there as First Lady. But the United States was also holding things back. And then another strategic decision had to be made. Do we go ahead without having all of the major powers on side? And he said yes, and history has shown that's the right decision. Earlier this year, Barack Obama said the United States will abide by the Anti-Personnel Landmine Convention, otherwise known as the Ottawa Convention, except in Korea. But we now have compliance with the treaty, with the one exception of the Korea where the U.S. feels it needs its landmine. So landmines was a major achievement. It bears the name of our nation's capital, but it was only the beginning. So on the disarmament front, major achievement. On the international criminal justice, there was this vague notion that you could have an international criminal court. And there had been precedents for specific cases in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, with the International Criminal Tribunal, the former Yugoslavia, and in Rwanda, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. But to create one that was open-ended and that would deal with future conflicts was a bold idea. And I remember being in this building as I was physical sciences don. I actually had a room just up the stairs here. And I was speaking with a lawyer who said to me, it's really not going to work. Whose laws are you going to use? Where are you going to hold the jails? Where are the courtrooms going to be? But Lloyd had the vision, appointed a top-notch lawyer, Philip Kirsch, who was legal advisor at Foreign Affairs, and they worked on negotiating a text which resulted in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which was signed during Lloyd's tenure, and Philip Kirsch became the first president of the International Criminal Court, which is currently located in The Hague. So another coup these are like achievements of a century. Not satisfied with that because you could see the human suffering. He worried about child soldiers. So he decided to assemble foreign ministers and NGOs, sort of replicating the Ottawa process, to a meeting in Winnipeg, his hometown. And there they came up with the basic provisions for the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child for dealing with war-affected children. And that's in force today. He worked against the NATO countries who wanted to continue with nuclear weapons as a supreme guarantee of peace. And realizing the fallacy of that statement, he attempted to change the quinquennial statement of NATO at the Washington Summit in 1999. One of the big troubling issues was when to intervene militarily. He's not a pacifist, but he's certainly not a militarist. And the decision came about what to do about Kosovo. There had been ethnic cleansing of a major scale by Milosevic in that province of Serbia. And NATO wanted to act. There was a Russian veto in the Security Council. And the decision had to be whether Canada was going to go in or not. And he struggled with his conscience. And in the end, he put Canada into the Kosovo campaign. The Canadian jets did 10% of the bombing, but also put restraints, including on General Wesley Clark, who would have liked to go after many other targets, but because of his knowledge and his wisdom, there were constraints put on by the foreign ministers on the top military commander. So he went into Kosovo, but was still troubled by that. So he decided to have Canada put forward the idea of an international commission to look at when to use force, military force. When is it right to use force? And what to do about future situations like Rwanda, like Kosovo. And it was Canada established and supervised the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. Used to be known as ISIS, but that name currently has a much more notorious connotation, so we'll say the International Commission. And it came up with a report which proposed the idea of responsibility to protect. And that has become a major new norm in the international community, for which there have been annual resolutions in the General Assembly and a special advisor to the Secretary General on R2P and ongoing debate, but it gave a framework for how their intervention should be done. Not only should there be a reaction against mass atrocities, but there should be preventive measures. And he was putting a lot of emphasis on prevention, then reaction, and then rebuilding afterwards. So it's all three together. It isn't just like in Libya, just go in and do the bombing. You really need all three specific responsibilities: prevention, reaction, and rebuilding. The last item that I should mention is when he was chair of the Security Council, which he chaired twice during the last time Canada was on the Security Council, 1999, 2000. He wanted to deal with the problems that peacekeepers have. And I teach soldiers about peacekeeping, and I know about their dilemmas, that they're seeing atrocities and they don't have the mandate to do something about it. Well, he put forward a resolution 1265 in the Security Council with the support of Kofi Annan to make it a provision of the Security Council to do protection of civilians when a peacekeeping operation is in the field. So no longer could the peacekeepers stand back, and no longer do they have to feel constrained if they saw mass atrocities occurring or imminent threats against the population, that they could intervene. So these are all achievements within the period 1996 to 2000. And that's why, if we're looking at Canada as a voice for peace and development, and I'm sorry I haven't had the chance to talk about the development side, but I won't steal any more of his time. Here is an individual who is supremely qualified who was the voice of peace and development for Canada, and it could now guide Canada as the voice of peace and development with the new Justin Trudeau government, with his sage advice and with his continuing the same thing that he's always done, communicating with the people, working with the people. That means us. And tonight he wants to have a conversation with us. So please join me in welcoming Lloyd Axworthy to the stage.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. It's nice to see everyone here on a Saturday night when the Maple Leafs are playing, so no, the competition is stiff. I must say I'm finding it just a little intimidating being here in Trinity and being surrounded by the portraits of the elders of the college that go back how many centuries, and they all seem to be looking down with a certain degree of skepticism about this guy from the north end of Winnipeg who's going to come and tell you about the new narratives for peace, order, and good government globally. But I appreciate the invitation and look forward to the evening of conversation. It started out certainly in a wonderful way. Meta Spencer took me to a pub on Adelaide, and we almost canceled tonight's meeting because we were having such a good time, but we're here nonetheless. And I want to thank Walter for making the suggestion that I have this opportunity to join with you and to have not just a conversation, but I hope would be in some ways a call to action. Just as a matter of introduction, Walter was extremely kind, and his introduction of my career, which is a little bit more checkered than he allowed. In fact, I think because we're in the age of transparency and openness and full disclosure, that I should provide some sort of counterpoint just to show that I'm well balanced. I was invited to speak at the university in Taiwan a few months after I'd retired from foreign affairs, and I thought this was a grand chance because as long as we held a ministerial portfolio, we weren't allowed to go to the other China. But this was a great chance to see for myself, and I kind of, a little jet lagged, but got up and gave a talk in a hall, I would say similar size to this, and it was going pretty well until this young man at the back, and I have no discrimination against young men at the back of the hall, I'm just providing a description, gets up and says, so Dr. Axworthy, would you tell us, you've been foreign minister for close to 5 years in Canada, and you live next door to the most powerful country in the world. You must have figured out some way to get along, that you've had no major strife and stress. Well, we have the problem across the Taiwan Straits. Can you give us some advice on what to do? Well, up to that time, I had been used to getting briefing notes from smart young men and women in the Foreign Affairs Department, now the Global Affairs Department, and it would usually say something very sage like, shut up, stupid, or something like that. And this time I was totally helpless. How do you answer a question like that when you're kind of bereft of anybody's good wisdom? So I immediately, in instinctive prairie fashion, fell back on my roots. And I said, well, there's an old saying in Manitoba that if you're making love to a porcupine, do it carefully. I don't think it translated into Chinese very well. And that was confirmed because the next morning I was going to one of these power breakfasts they have where you get up at 5 in the morning to make sure that you're there when the market opens. And when I came into the room for breakfast, it wasn't exactly a wild, whooping, cordial reception. In fact, nobody would look at me. So I said to my host, look, have I committed some mistake in the protocol? I'm not getting a kind of a warm and fuzzy feeling here. He said, well, it may have something to do with this morning's newspaper reported your speech last night at the university. I said, well, what did it report that I said? They said, well, when you were asked this question about how Taiwan might deal with its big, powerful neighbor, you said, well, it's like making love to a concubine. So, so if you think that I am the author of new theories of international relations, there's one that you can tuck away for, and if you want to have a conversation, we can get into that. Decision to hold this particular event, as Walter pointed out, was 3 or 4 months ago, and it was before the election, and it was, I suppose, as much an opportunity for me to lament as it was to have conversation because of the high degree of frustration I was feeling, and I think it was shared by other Canadians, about what Canada had ceased to become in the world, that we had really put the handcuffs on, and that we'd really altered the voice of Canada to be one that was a little sort of picky, a little muted, and certainly was not engaged with the broad scope of rights and interests of the global population. And I know that sounds like such a grandiose statement to make, but when we talked about the idea of human security, it's a pretty simple one in a way, and that is that everybody, and if we go back to probably our best philosopher, Charles Taylor, that everybody has an affirmation to have an ordinary life, to live in freedom from fear that they will not be shot in the morning, or their kids will be denied going to school, or there won't be enough food or water to feed a family, things that we often take for granted, but large parts of the world don't, and that is part of the responsibility for those who are privileged, who have the incredibly skill and talent to be born into a country that enables us to provide a affirmation of an ordinary life, not a celebrity life, not a grandeur life, but something that just gives us the right to exercise our thoughts and our talents as individual human beings. It's no big deal. It goes back into our philosophies of natural rights. It comes out of the various religious groups that have helped form this country. But the problem is it was being denied to far too many because we were allowing a viciousness that unleashed the worst of the devils inside us to the point where mass murder had become, certainly during the period of the Second World War, mass murder of civilians had become the standard, not the exception, and that the atrocities of killing Jews and Ukrainians and Lithuanians and all those who were gypsies and Romas, all those subject to nothing more than just being who they were, to being the victims of their state, or people within that state, became intolerant. I mean, and there's no doubt that at the end of that war, I mean, I'm a child of the war. My father fought in it, and my uncles and so on. I wasn't quite ready, although I'm beginning to feel that I'm about that stage. But there was a purpose, and that was to try to bring some sense of that affirmation that Charles Taylor talks about to a much wider orbit of people, to make sure that what we enjoyed could be shared. And that's why we began to build up institutions and laws. We don't realize how new so much of this is. The UN Convention on Human Rights. The UN itself is celebrating its 70th year. Well, there's a few people in this room, I know one, who is older than the United Nations. So am I. Not a long time for a practice and an institution take root in this world, but it has. And then we got into the incredible enactment of the Genocide Convention, where Raphael Lemkin, you know the story, who was a lawyer in Poland and had the forebodings that as the Nazis began to take over Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland and other areas, that it was time to try to maybe move on, and went to Lithuania and found out that all of a sudden the Soviets and the German and the Nazis had come together with a pact of agreement which began to provide for a collaboration in the willingness and the will just to, without cause or concern, murder large parts of the people because they didn't quite fit their definition of who should live in the world. And Lemkin, I like to use the story because he finally came through Spain and then settled at Duke University in the United States. And it's one reason why I always have such a sense of honor about universities, because they do provide sanctuary. They do provide a place where people have a freedom to speak, as long as we permit it. He was the one that, based on hard evidence gathered through the wide monitoring and circulation of his friends in Europe at the time, was able to put together the fact that mass murder was taking place. And Allied leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt and Mackenzie, they all knew it, but they weren't going to talk about it publicly. It was a crime that had no name. And Lemkin said it's called genocide, the mass murder of people, and was able, through his efforts and those of his students, to finally begin to bring about a sense of purpose, which resulted in the Genocide Convention, an international treaty that says that crimes against humanity are unlawful and unethical and must be stopped. And that's late 1940s thinking. And you would have thought that from that point on, and Nuremberg trials and all the other efforts that we've made, that we would come to a increasing sense of progress, that we are winnowing and shrinking those acts of atrocity, but in fact, we're not. Thing that I suppose really struck me when I was asked by Mr. Chrétien to become the foreign minister is that I gained access to the telegrams that Romeo Dallaire was sending back to the United Nations. And he was copying those of us in the Canadian cabinet. And it was hard to imagine that even at that period of time, what we would call the world community, the global community, as represented through the United Nations, was answering back this cri de coeur for assistance in stopping the murder that was about to take place. He could see it coming, he could smell it in the air, he could see it in the kind of rancid propaganda on the radios, that something was about to burst. And the basic response from the UN said, it's terrible, it's horrible, but there's nothing we can do. And even the peacekeepers who were in Rwanda at the time, 1,200 Belgian soldiers, were told they could not intervene because we based the United Nations on this thing called sovereignty, Article 2.7, that says you can do what you want to do inside your own boundaries of your own country. And that sovereignty was elevated to a sacred level, even though it was a compromise solution going back to the West, the 30 Years' Wars and so on. We'd been around a long time, but we had kind of built around it this kind of sanctity that because you were a prime minister or a general or a head of an intelligence agency, you could do what you want. There was no accountability. And you had impunity from any form of prosecution. And through that, compounded by what happened in Srebrenica, where many of you will remember our own soldiers being chained to a post. And the Dutch soldiers who were, I guess from our point of view, fortunate that, for us, that they just took over the command in Srebrenica 2 days before we had to leave and had to stand idly by while 6,000 men and boys were taken to a mine shaft and murdered and killed for no reason other than they were Muslims, Kosovars. How can you be in the government of Canada at that time and see this sort of thing going on and say, how do we allow this to happen? I mean, put aside all our kind of disputes about economies and taxes and everything else. How can we stand by and let this take place? And I would say to the credit of Canadians and to colleagues and to Prime Minister, is that when we propose that we shift our foreign policy into a view of human security, the protection of the life of these individuals, it was adopted, it was accepted as being a legitimate mission for Canada to carry out. And in fact, it led, as Walter properly pointed out, to a variety of efforts to say, let's put in place some rules, some laws, some treaties, some institutions that will slowly provide protection. The landmine treaty was not just simply to get rid of landmines, it's that landmines had stopped killing combatants, because after the war was over, the combatants left and went home or went somewhere else. But what was left was still in the ground. And I'll never forget a experience I had early on when I went to a sort of a rehabilitation center in Accra. And there was a young girl of 12 years old who had had her arm blown off up into the socket. And this wasn't just a physical thing, this is, I mean, her life had been dramatically changed. And I said, how did it happen? She said, well, I was out in my father's vineyard and I saw some colored objects that looked like toys, and I thought I would, they were made like butterflies. She said, I will take one home for my brother to play with. And when she picked it up in her hand, the warmth from her palm ignited the landmine and blew her arm off. Now look, I'm not here to be kind of, on a Saturday night to make you think you want to go back to watch the hockey game. But it just struck me that we'd reached a point in our civilization, in our evolution as a group of people, that was just not tolerable. And that's why I think at the time it did become a mission for us to find the ways in which we could use our resources and our skills and our talents. And we had them. We had the Foreign Service, which I thought was second to none. They were smart and they were creative, and we maintained probably a network of diplomacies much larger than most countries of our size. Why? Because we thought we should properly be a player in this new global emerging context. And at the same time, it wasn't just happening to other people, it was happening to Canadians. I mean, in my first month as a foreign minister, I get a telegram that a young newly wedded couple had been blown up in a terrorist bomb in the subways in Paris. The nurse from Alberta had been hacked to death in Chechnya. A group of business people visiting Colombia had been kidnapped and were being held for ransom and were subject to sort of a death treatment if they didn't deliver. Their companies didn't fess up. And yet I went back to the letter that I received when I became a Minister of Foreign that says that your first priority is the protection of Canadians. And I asked myself, how do you protect Canadians? Because Canadians like to travel, they do business, they're visitors, they're students. And the only way to do it is if we've got agreements with other countries, with other people, that we're going to provide mutual protection, that we're going to protect each other. And when we came to the notion of a responsibility to protect, it wasn't just us, it was saying that is an ordinance for all of us to look at. How do we provide that protection based on the best of our abilities, working in a collaborative, cooperative way, and finding various ways in which that protection could be afforded. And for a time, I thought we were making progress, until if you look at the figures in the last 5 years, that while there was been a slow, gradual decline of violence in the world, violence against women and rape and children and innocents, it began to spike up beginning around 2004 and 5. Why? Because all of a sudden, the order was breaking down. There was no willingness. After 9/11, the watchword was terrorism and national security. It wasn't protection of people. And the resources and the kind of focus began to shift towards the kind of threat and risk that terrorism obviously provides, but in many cases we end up supporting or allying ourselves with people who are also using their political position to murder their own people, and using the pretext of what the war on terrorism was called, was to acquire enormous capacity. So, what was happening in Cambodia? 1 million people murdered. What was happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? And I'm going to tell you something tonight. I don't think it's ever been talked about publicly, and I'm not saying there's big revelations. It's fair enough to say. But I was at my home in Winnipeg. We were having a Christmas party with my family, and I got a call from Prime Minister Chrétien, and he's saying, "I want you in Ottawa Monday morning." Oh, well. I thought maybe he's going to give me a Christmas present. He said, "No, I've been watching television. I've been watching what's happening to the refugees in the camps who've escaped the massacre going on in Rwanda and had ended up in the camps. But what had happened, a lot of the Hutu sort of murderers had become genocidaires and had got into the camps, infiltrated them, and were now murdering people in refugee camps in the eastern Congo by the thousands." He said, "We can't let this go on." And there was, sure enough, you turn the news on, there's long lines of hundreds, tens of thousands of people moving to try to escape from being attacked by genocidaires. So I met with the Prime Minister, with the Minister of Defense, with our own officials, and said, "What can we do?" And they said, "Well, the best thing we should do is maybe find a way to put UN peacekeepers in to try to separate the victims from the genocidaires, provide a buffer, provide a zone, a sanctuary, a haven." Okay? So we went to work, and we got 11 other countries prepared to join in. We got a mandate from the Security Council to undertake a peacekeeping mission. We had people on the airplanes, our own troops from the Netherlands and from Norway and from Mozambique and other places. And we had an advance party in Entebbe, which was 300 miles from eastern Congo. And all of a sudden we received a call from, let's just say, 2 of our larger allies who said, "Oh, stop the mission because the issue's over. Nobody's being murdered there." We said, "Well, wait a minute." And then all of a sudden they come and start showing us maps where it looks like, it's Sunday by the seaside. Couldn't find anybody that was being attacked. And I can tell you why, because they doctored the photographs. And so our mission stood down. Our military said, "There's no reason to go, nothing we can do." I said, "Well, maybe we can just fly over the place, and drop a parachute or 2 and put some people in there and do it, see for ourselves." Nah, if our good allies say it's over, it's over. We didn't go in. We took the planes from Entebbe and went back home, as did our other peacekeeping allies. 15 years later, 6 million people have been killed in the eastern Congo. Would that have happened if we had gone there and stayed? And stayed for a long time? Because peacekeeping missions are not short-term quick fixes. Ask yourself this. Ask yourself how you feel about the fact that we were on the edge. We had got all the right protocols and the decisions. We had the right people to do it. And we got conned. And we didn't have the capacity ourselves. We were selling satellite monitors to the United States so they could take the pictures, but we didn't put any investment ourselves into doing our own surveillance and our own monitoring. We were relying upon 1 or 2 other sort of sources for good information, for early warning, for responding. I got to tell you how I feel. I feel kind of disgusted with myself a little bit that we didn't go ahead and I didn't fight harder to maintain that mission on behalf of Canadians, because I think we could have made something happen that would have saved a lot of lives and maybe even enhanced the notion that people with blue helmets must be given a mandate to step in when there is unwarranted murder or ethnic cleansing going on. But we didn't do it, and from that point on, our interest in peacekeeping began to fade to the point now where, well, I think Walter Dorn knows the numbers better than I do, but at one point we had the largest peacekeeping contingents in the world. We're now down to number 80. I think we may have 18 soldiers and about 50 policemen around the world doing peacekeeping duties. That's the conversation I wanted to have with you. It's the conversation I thought we should have as a group of Canadians, especially those of you who have been involved in Science for Peace and peace movements in Pugwash, where I think you have already clearly expressed your concern and interest in finding some way of providing more security and safety in the world. It's a conversation we still have to have, even though circumstances have changed dramatically. We know now that the kind of shrinkage that had been taking place now has a chance to be reborn. Prime Minister Trudeau said on the night of his election, we're back. What does that mean? Well, first thing it is, he gave a get out of jail coupon to our diplomats, so they were no longer told they could not go anywhere or speak anywhere or make any public utterances, even though that was their job. They can now exercise their full creative talents. We've made a commitment to go to Paris as part of the UN environmental meeting and do something meaningful about emission controls. And, I think President Obama got the message, canceled the pipeline, and now we've got a clean slate. We can start talking to the Americans about a whole range of things on our continent that we couldn't talk about before because we only had a one-note song that we were singing for 10 years in Washington. But here's the question. What's going to be that? What is that narrative going to be? And I think we make a mistake if we dwell too much in nostalgia and say, well, we can go back to what we did. No. This is a new generation of political leadership. They come from a different place. They take the values of the Pearsonian model, but they want to translate those values into a contemporary vernacular. They want to make it work for the kind of world that we're in. And to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily, sure, the precedents that have been established are useful to learn from, and maybe even draw some lessons from. But my sense is that this is a government and a leader who wants to find a pathway, a direction, a narrative that suits the time. So where do we start? Well, Prime Minister Trudeau is going off to the G20 in a week's time. Very important meeting of 20 of the most powerful countries in the world. What would you want to say to him as a mission? Would you say the most important thing for you to talk about when you get there is the fact that there is mass destruction going on in Syria? There's 13 million people who've been displaced, close to 250,000 killed, children starving for lack of food, 12 million refugees on the border, which are now swamping Europe, creating turbulence throughout the entire global system. And furthermore, I don't want to be part of the bombing campaign. So what's the alternative? What do we as Canadians want Prime Minister Trudeau to say a week from now at the G20 about Syria? Are we going to stand up and say, wait a minute, now we can really go to work. We don't have to play the minuet or fancy dance. We can now step in and say, this is mass suffering of a kind that we haven't again seen for decades. And I think, if you want my opinion, and I guess maybe you do because some of you came, so prima facie, there's some interest. I don't think it's a matter of how many people we take in. I mean, the media, is it going to be 25,000? Is it going to be 16? Can John McCallum really manage this by the end of the year? Yes, of course we want resettlement. But the fundamental problem is that what we're seeing taking place, emerging out of Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia, this tidal wave of refugees right now is a trickle compared to what's to come. The president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which does the epidemiology on these kinds of things taking place, said this is just the beginning, because right now we have 60 million displaced persons in the world. And that's going to grow probably to 90 million as the impact of more conflict takes place. If the Middle East continues to crack wide open, if Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey can no longer handle the camps, if more and more people are starving inside the countries, if the young kids from El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala who are being murdered by the drug cartels are streaming out of their small towns, heading north to try to find some migration sanctuary, if the tribal people in northern Burma are being kicked out of their homes and into the oceans, and Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries are sending destroyers out to push them back, you think it's over? You think another settlement program is going to deal with that? No. What we'll have to deal with is that we've got to come together and say, this is a global phenomenon. This is something that affects all of us. Every one of us has got a stake in this. And so, in part, there is a precedent. At the time of the Vietnamese boat people, there was international collaboration. We all took part in it, but we also took part in helping in the redevelopment and resettlement within those countries themselves, within the regions themselves. But we also set up new rules. How do you judge who's a refugee, who is officially someone escaping persecution? Well, refugees are now coming because there's no longer any water in their region. Nothing to drink, nothing to keep their cattle or their animals alive. You think they're going to hang around and just die because they don't have water? Or are they going to move? And that's something we can do something about. This is not, I'm not saying that we're faced with the great imponderable. There is all kinds of ways of managing that kind of movement. We managed it in Europe at the end of the Second World War. Millions of people were refugees. We found answers. We had a Marshall Plan. I know that sounds crazy today because, my God, the new Minister of Finance from the good city of Toronto would have a cardiac if you talked about some modern equivalent of a Marshall Plan to reinvest back into and allow people in their own region to settle and establish some governance and some protection and some security. But we did it in Europe. We rebuilt the economies of Germany and France and Great Britain and Poland and Ukraine. So I don't know. Sure, it was the end of a war, and I get all that. But tell me how this is different. So do we want our Prime Minister? Let's have that conversation. To say we've got to do something about Syria, about the refugees, about what's taking place. And I think we have an opportunity because I think we're now in a position where, as Prime Minister Trudeau says to President Obama, I'm not going to be part of the bombing coalition, but I'm prepared to come in and work on the humanitarian resettlement and redevelopment and providing safe havens and proper places in which people can be looked after. Then I think we have a conversation between two progressive leaders taking place. But I don't think it happens in a vacuum. I think there's got to be signals. There's got to be, politicians know how to do two things well. They know how to count when it comes to election time. And most of them know how to listen to get things done. But if nobody's out there talking, and there isn't a conversation going on, it's going to be based upon old briefs and old sorts of conventional wisdoms, and who knows? But because we've now got rid of the pipeline, I think we can start a whole new conversation with the Americans. Oh, and let's bring the Mexicans in for just keeping North America together. That means we'd have to take the visas off Mexicans, which were put on because, I don't know the reason, they thought there were too many Mexican field workers in the tomato fields of Ontario. Well, what the hell? And so as a result, we have not had relations with Mexico now for 7 years. All right, so let's correct that and let's get it together. Let's get North America working around not only its own issues of energy and environment, but also becoming part of that responsibility to protect movement that needs to take place in the world itself. In fact, if you really want to get brave and bold about it, our own front yard, our Arctic, is now the hot spot when it comes to climate change. It's where the fastest melting is taking place, where the animal, flora, and fauna. There's a study done by a woman named Margaret Ackerman from Reading University in Great Britain, who's been working on the Arctic for years, who's now pointing out because of the melting of the permafrost, toxins are being released into the food chain that we haven't seen for thousands of years. And then all of a sudden there's a whole new sort of generation of diseases beginning to emerge with the muskox and the caribou and areas like that. And soon, if it's in that food chain, it's going to get into the food chain of the local indigenous people. So that's a pretty good conversation to have with the Americans in Alaska and maybe the Russians in Siberia. Russians have several hundred sites where they buried anthrax during the Second World War. Well, that's going to start popping out because of the melting of the permafrost. I think that's a pretty good discussion to have around how do we provide better protection for people. And I think that, for me, it's those kind of conversations that can really begin to generate a new sense of understanding, a new narrative around what Canadians think are our responsibilities. And I have confidence, in fact, that we're up to that level of discussion and conversation. Wouldn't be here tonight if I didn't think that in our NGO community, and our universities, and our think tanks, and our business chambers, and our labor unions, there wasn't the capacity to begin thinking about these things, to start talking about them, to inform the newly elected MPs, the new government, that here's the things that we want to stand up for. You're saying Canada's back? Not only are we back, but we're going forward. And that's the kind of conversation we need to have tonight. Thank you very much.